Welcome to this first Royal Society for Asian Affairs event of 2026, and the third in our series, Power, Legitimacy and Influence, The Future of Asia. The series is exploring 6 long-standing regimes in Asia that have had and continue to have a huge influence outside their own borders, shaping the region and its trajectory. It considers their leadership, the sources of their legitimacy, and their guiding doctrine in order to gain an insight into what the future of Asia might look like. Last year, the series covered President Erdogan in Turkey and the Islamic Republic of Iran, but today we turn our attention to India. India has endured a demanding 18 months marked by heightened regional tensions, persistent border security challenges, and the strain of managing domestic political pressures amid a volatile global economy. At the same time, a more unstable neighborhood and intensifying great power rivalry in the Indo-Pacific have tested New Delhi's strategic confidence and diplomatic resilience. Today's panel discussion will examine India and the influence of Narendra Modi's rise to power. The panel will discuss the role of Hindu nationalism, pushed forward by the political dominance of the BJP, on India's politics and economy, as well as its place in the world. It will consider how Modi's approach to the US, China, and Pakistan is helping or hindering India's position, and whether India has the potential to become a superpower of the future. We have a fantastic panel with us today, who will be moderated by Neha Dixit. Neha is an award-winning investigative journalist and author based in New Delhi. Her work examines politics, gender, and social justice across South Asia. A former India Today reporter, she now writes independently for outlets including the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and The Wire, uncovering human rights abuses and systemic inequality. As always, there will be time for questions in the second half of today's session, so please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. But otherwise, I shall now hand over to Neha to start the panel.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for that. I really want to start with some recent statistics that we have at hand. According to Oxfam, the top 10% of the Indian population holds 77% of the total national wealth. I also want to point out that there's another report that suggests that India's income and wealth inequality right now is more extreme than during the British colonial times. 90% of the Indian population have no money to spend on non-essential items. And I also want to say that in the recent Press Freedom Index, India ranks 151st out of 180 countries, which puts it into the very serious category. The other report that I also want to mention is the 2021 Freedom House annual flagship reports that highlights the deterioration of civil rights and liberties in India since Narendra Modi and his ruling Bharatiya Janata Party came to power in 2014, including increased pressure on human rights organizations, rising intimidation of academics and journalists, and a spate of bigoted attacks, including lynchings aimed at Muslims. Why these reports are important is because last year, India saw 84% rise in communal riots, and several human and religious rights advocates have claimed that dozens of assaults on Christians during Christmas celebrations took place just last month. Yet Indian government continues to be in denial. It refuses and rejects any independent studies. It rejects the claims of authoritarianism and human rights violation and its sectarian policies. And in fact, a lot of times they've turned around and made claims, for instance, said that India ranks 4th globally in income equality, as opposed to any of the reports that we have right now. Why I say this is because this is a time where, in the first time in Indian history, for the last 11 years, our Prime Minister has not even given a single press conference. Our cabinet ministers have not just coined but normalized words like prostitute for journalists who ask questions. As we speak, several journalists, academics, activists are in jail under draconian laws like the National Security Act and sedition without any trial or bail. And leaders and office bearers of the BJP continue to incite violence against minorities and marginalized communities, and even facilitate the violence mongers and murderers and killers. This, in addition to the several of our billionaires who've run away with our money, and at the same time, there's a deep corporate political nexus right now in India where certain corporate groups are favored, and now even making donations to BJP and many other political parties has been legitimized through electoral bonds, which has made BJP the richest political party in India. With these ideas and with these thoughts, I want to open this discussion under this backdrop of Hindu nationalism and the existing corporate political nexus to understand how can India even become a superpower. I'm very happy to welcome all our panelists today. Dr. Sripad Motiram is an associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, whose work spans development economics, welfare economics, microeconomics, and political economy. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Southern California. His research explores themes including urbanization in developing countries, inequality, poverty, and the political economy of India. Professor Kate Sullivan D. Estrada is Associate Professor in the International Relations of South Asia at the University of Oxford and the Director of Contemporary South Asian Studies Program. Her research explores how rising powers, especially India, seek status in world politics, focusing on identity, nuclear politics in South Asia, India's Indo Pacific strategy, and Indian Ocean security. She's engaged in policy work, including a secondment as principal research analyst for India at the UK FCDO, and has given testimony to UK parliamentary inquiries on UK India relations. Welcome, Professor Kate. Javed Gaya is a lawyer based in Mumbai, specializing in commercial arbitration law. He studied jurisprudence at the University of Oxford and has taught law at colleges affiliated with the University of Mumbai. He contributes to publications on constitutional law, history, and foreign affairs, and writes book reviews. His new book, Majoritarianism in India, investigates the origin and consequences of India's increasing majoritarian system. I welcome you all. I want to open this session with Dr. Sripad. Dr. Sripad, I want you to start with how do you assess this entire situation with, like I said, the corporate political nexus, the neoliberal politics, the rise of Hindu nationalism. How do all of these go together in our vision or India's vision of becoming a superpower?
Okay. Thank you, Neha. So all of you and the audience knows that for a long time, prior to the 1990s, India followed a model of planned development. Post 1990s, it changed track, went on a newer paradigm, and we could say that all the regimes that have been in power have broadly been neoliberal. That's a useful way of talking about it, but uh, neoliberalism works unevenly across space and time. So, what I want to do is to focus on, for example, how the Modi regimes, NDA regimes under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, are different from previous regimes, in particular UPA 1 and 2. Some theorists have used the term actually existing neoliberalism to talk about this unevenness. Now, one of the problems that we have when we are trying to assess what happened in the last 10 to 15 years with respect to the economy is that there is a lack of high quality data, and this is not a coincidence, in the sense that many regimes which want to consolidate power, which are authoritarian, uh, do not want an objective narrative of the economy. So they try to actually control this narrative, interfere in the work of statistical organizations, try to actually erode their independence. Now, this is something that has been done. With a few friends, I actually circulated a petition which got wide publicity in the Indian media. A lot of economists endorsed it. And what this has done, which is directly relevant, is that the data quality is not good for us to actually talk very objectively about what has happened in the realm of the economy. But um, we can also see this as a marker in the sense that this regime or these regimes under Prime Minister Modi are different because they are trying to do something with the statistical agencies which prior regimes did not want to do. And in some sense, the Indian statistical system was an exemplar even among developed countries, and we have lost that credibility now. So we have to keep that in mind. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to look at the larger macro policies and outcomes, and the distribution which Neha was referring to. And then I will also talk a little bit about welfare. And through the discussion of these three, I will weave in some of the larger questions that we are pondering about. So in terms of the macro policies, there are three major shocks that the Indian economy has witnessed under Prime Minister Modi. One is demonetization. Two is the implementation of the GST, goods and services tax. And third is, of course, COVID. Now, the first two are basically policy shocks, and they followed one after the other. And the third one, COVID, of course, you could say it's a natural, it's a pandemic, but then it was mismanaged, particularly the second wave, mismanaged in terms of the human cost, but also in terms of its effect on the economy. And we now know through RTIs that the demonetization is something that the RBI did not want. So what did these do? They really hurt the informal economy, which, of course, the estimates of the informal economy are always, very fuzzy, but it's fair to say that more than 90% of Indian workforce could be classified under the informal economy. And these moves, these policy disasters, you could say, hurt the informal economy. And Indian per capita national income was growing. Per capita GDP was showing an up growth rate, was showing an upward trend prior to these NDA regimes, and now you see that upward trend has been reversed. So there has been this is a consequence of these policies, and India has been going through what some economists have called premature deindustrialization or premature non-industrialization. If you look at the trajectory of Western developed countries, they had what economists refer to as a structural transformation. They had an agrarian economy, then they moved to an industry-based economy, a manufacturing-based economy, and then they became more service-oriented. Now, some of the Asian economies are somewhat going through the similar pattern. Now, India, despite attempts, has not been able to spur its manufacturing. Now, this is a problem that we have seen since the 1990s, but it has deepened under the NDA regime. Now, this is something one of my co-authors, Professor Nagaraj, has worked extensively on, and I'm drawing on his work. Now, so this is what has happened to the economy. India has not been able to spur its manufacturing. India has also become import dependent. India is dependent on imports from China, and India has also, started experiencing a slowdown in its savings rate and investment rate, which have long-term consequences. So these are the macro policies and outcomes that we have seen under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. Now, when we look at the distribution side, something that Neha was referring to, uh, what do we see? Now, when we look at the distribution side, uh, when we, historically, India has collected consumption data and used the national sample surveys on consumption expenditure to track poverty and inequality. Now, after 2011-12, there was one more survey which was not released to the public. Recently, there are two surveys, household consumption expenditure surveys, back to back surveys that have been conducted, and the data has been released, but they are not strictly comparable with previous surveys that NSS has done, National Sample Survey. So there are some comparability issues, but nevertheless, what the report has tried to do is to actually compare the inequality estimates from the latest surveys with the previous surveys, because it shows decline. So this is good. So we will show it even if there is a problem with comparability. But we have wealth data, and there is evidence to suggest that wealth inequality has increased. Now, wealth, there is a survey called the All India Debt and Investment Survey. But beyond that, there is something called the Hurun list, which I have personally worked with, and some other people have worked with, which gives the list of people who have net worth, wealth above 1,000 crores. And when you try to track these people, um, you will see that there has been an increase in high net worth people. For example, US dollar billionaires between 2012 and 2022 has increased. The number of US dollar billionaires has increased almost by 4 times. And the high net worth individuals also have increased during this period almost by 10 times. And uh, in the recent Hurun list, India added about 94 billionaires, and China has added 55 in comparison. Mumbai is considered to be the billionaire capital of Asia now because it has the largest number of billionaires in any Asian city. Thomas Piketty and his co-authors looked at a lot of data and try to look at all the evidence, and they say that if you look at the top 1% of Indians in terms of the top 1% um, income, they hold 22.6% of the total income, and in terms of wealth they own 40.1%. So this is not just very high, but it is also very high in comparison with countries like China, Brazil, US. So at this point, Indian inequalities, according to all this evidence, is at an unprecedented level. Now, um, this is a reflection of changing state capital relations. Another way of looking at it is if you look at what is uh, sometimes referred to as industrial concentration, what is going on with industry, who are the firms that are dominant. So you see what has been happening in the recent decades is that uh, there has been a rise in industrial concentration. There are five business groups: Tata's, Adani's, Aditya Birla, Mukesh Ambani, and Bharti, uh, that have increased their share. Now, this is actually a conscious result of, or rather, a result of conscious policy to, privilege or promote certain industries. So this is one way of thinking about what is going on with state capital relations. Now, some people have tried to use the term crony capitalism to capture this. Now, one of the issues with using the term, I'm somewhat uncomfortable with it, is that when you think about crony capitalism, the normative understanding is that there is no level playing field among capitalists. So the better thing is to have a capitalism with a level playing field. Now, that could be a problem, but this is also not capturing the extensive corruption that we have in recent decades, for example, through the electoral bond scheme, right? Which is again something that was rammed through. It did not have, there wasn't like there were the organizations that were against this. So this is what has happened in terms of distribution. And finally, I want to talk about welfare. Again, um, Neha referred to this. Now, if you look at UPA, as I said, UPA was a neoliberal regime, but some of you may remember that UPA came to power um, when there was a India Shining campaign, but India was actually experiencing enormous rural distress. And so when the NDA lost, UPA came to power, people understood that this is a consequence of the neglect of the poorer sections, particularly in rural areas. So UPA, particularly UPA 1, had a welfareist orientation. They put in rights based measures. And the biggest thing that they did was the MNREGA. This is the largest employment guarantee program in the world. It was a work fair kind of program. And now when you think about the welfare approach of Modi and NDA, um, what the approach is different. They are actually trying to kill this rights-based approach. You see this with what they have done with RTI. They have tried to put amendments. They have tried to actually, make RTI toothless in multiple ways. Now, this is in confirm. This confirms with, an authoritarian kind of model. But they have now recently tried to kill MNREGA also. This new act that they have put in, which has a very strange name, acronym like VG Gram G, uh, tries to actually kill the rights-based spirit in MNREGA, apart from other things like, for example, the share of center versus state. Uh, so the Modi regime's approach to welfare is sometimes being referred to as the new welfareism or the new welfareism of the right. India historically, we have no regime has been deeply welfareist. For example, no regime has really tried to provide high quality public education or public health. you know but what is happening here is that under NDA, the welfareism is trying to actually provide things like cash transfers, gas cylinders, private goods that are largely in the private realm, right? That is what they are trying to do. So it's not very deep in a welfare sense, but it is a kind of palliative, and it has also not worked very well. There has been also a rebranding of certain, uh, you know, welfare programs under earlier times. For example, the Nirmal Bharat has been just rechristened as Swachh Bharat. So there is no great deep commitment to welfare here. There's a different approach to welfare, and there is also a personality cult built around the personality of Prime Minister Modi in terms of some of these schemes. You see his picture everywhere. I am in my 50s. I have been vaccinated many times in India, and vaccine certificates never had photographs. Whereas, you look at the COVID one, there are all these jokes. So there's a personality cult around these welfare programs. It's a different approach to welfare. Just to tie in with the Hindutva story, um, when you put all this together, particularly the welfare idea together, some people have tried to argue, like one of my co-authors, Vamsi Vakulavarnam, has tried to argue that based on the work of political scientist Muller, that what we are seeing under Prime Minister Modi is a kind of plutocratic populism where it works for the wealthy and elite. The economy, the larger regime delivers for the wealthy and the elite. But uh, you also have an ideological commitment to Hindutva, and also you have this Hindutva and these populism for mobilizations, electoral and otherwise. So that is one way of understanding this.
Thank you so much for this, giving us an overall picture of what is happening. And I want to get in Professor Kate here, because a lot of these things that Dr. Sripad spoke about, how you have been looking at India and in the world stage. India has been ambitious, and particularly Modi has been ambitious, and you've written in detail about Vishwaguru, and we'll come back to that. Uh, this is the first time we don't get along with any of our neighbors in the subcontinent. We are in a difficult situation. We just had something in May, which was a sort of uh, quote unquote war with Pakistan, and there has been like a lot of jingoism. You've written in detail about how India has been sending out signals, what is the kind of positioning it's been doing in the world stage. I want you to come in and talk to us about how the world is looking at India, and particularly with the rise of Hindu nationalism, and generally with how its relation has been with various countries, its foreign policies, its trade policies. So we would love to hear more from you on that.
I'm delighted to be part of this cross-disciplinary panel. It sits in a really timely and fascinating series, and it's a real privilege to feature alongside my co-panelists and to learn from their perspectives. And as you've rightly pointed out, Neha, my task today is to reflect on India's place in the world. And I want to suggest, I think, in a way that complements some of the comments we've heard already today on this sort of anxiety or fixation on international rankings and contestation around those rankings, that international recognition really is at the heart of the story of Modi's India or the BJP's India in world politics over the past decade. And this is a dynamic that reaches, of course, between the domestic and the international divide. It's very paradoxical in its aims and logics, and it's also very unstable, not least given the current wider international context of flux that we're all currently living through, including in the last few days in the UK and Europe. So, first, I think it's really important to point out how success at the international recognition of India abroad spells success at recognition of Modi and his leadership at home. And I think he's potentially the first leader that has really picked this idea up and run with it. And we have seen a significant popularization of foreign policy in India. A Pew survey from 2023 found that 68% of Indian adults said that India's influence in the world had been growing stronger in recent years. And of that 68%, most were, or a larger proportion were supporters of the NDA, so the alliance to which Modi's BJP belongs. Now, of course, growing interest in foreign policy in India was already a trend in progress. We moved from a situation where foreign policy issues were insulated from wider Indian political culture, where election campaigns revolved around social, political, economic issues, not foreign policy, to a situation in the post-Cold War era where India's accelerated economic growth, heightened foreign trade and foreign investment led Indian business to be more interested in foreign policy at the same time as a revolution in the Indian media, and of course the growth of a kind of globalizing Indian middle class. So public opinion on certain foreign policy issues began to pick up from the mid-1990s. But of course, Mr. Modi caught hold of, amplified, and I think to an extent vernacularized this trend. And he did it through the instantiation of what we might call recognition spectacles abroad, hugs with world leaders, particularly Western world leaders, stadium scale diaspora events, largely again in the West, thinking of Madison Square Garden in 2014, Wembley Stadium 2015, the Howdy Modi mega event in Houston, Texas in 2019, and the Kudos Bank Arena event in Sydney in 2023, just to mention a few. And of course, his office amplified and reproduced these conspicuous moments of recognition at home with the savvy use of traditional and social media, and of course, some substantial degree of control of the former. It's difficult to exaggerate just how crucial international recognition has been for Modi's domestic political project, which of course is centered on the elimination of opposition and the imposition of a narrow Hindu nationalist agenda upon India. And we've seen repeated comments, for example, from Minister of Home Affairs Amit Shah, who has repeatedly identified Modi with India and his personal recognition abroad with that of the nation. World over, Shah said, people started looking at India with respect after Modi came to power. And in the run-up to the 2024 elections, Shah said that Modi has been the most popular person, not only in India, but globally. Of course, recognition of Modi's India is projected as tied up with what Jayati Srivastava has set out as a Hindu civilizational state conception that draws its intellectual roots from early Hindutva ideologues and is based on a sort of oppositional and very homogenous understanding of a Hindu-Indian civilization. The second point about the emphasis on international recognition is just how paradoxical it is. I think in arguing that international recognition matters to Modi and the BJP, I join a long line of scholars who underscore how Hindutva intersects with the global aspirations of its ideological proponents. So thinking of the work of Thomas Blom Hansen, who argued that Hindu nationalists since the late 1980s have sought to gain recognition for India from the West in particular as a proper nation. We could also look at the work of Ravinder Kaur, Katarina Kimball, Ted Svensson. My own work, which you kindly referenced, Neha, places India's foreign policy under Modi in conversation with wider scholarly work on recognition in international relations. So again, this is a much more sociological way of thinking through these questions of India's place in the world, particularly the work of Rebecca Arden-Nissen and Aisha Zarakol, who talk about the liberal international order as a recognition order. So and they highlight, they sort of attribute part of the decay of that order to states and populations within states reacting to long experiences of misrecognition within that order, particularly among states who are at its periphery or semi-periphery. And of course, this highlights a resentment with the liberal project, both internationally and in its domestic manifestations. And when we bring this work together with work on populism, we see a really interesting contradiction with the Indian case, because we know that populist leaders are generally read as anti-elitist and anti-pluralist in their domestic political discourses. We see that, of course, in this case, but also in their foreign policy discourses. But that hasn't been the case with India. So as again, emerging work on India as India's populism in foreign policy, Johannes Plagerman and Sandra Destradi have highlighted how there's been a really surprising degree of openness and cooperative impetus in India's foreign policy under Modi, who's tried to present India as contributing to global public goods rather than turning away from international institutions in the kind of Trumpian style, and rather than asserting a narrow, inward-looking nationalism, as again Trump has. So the paradox then is this mismatch between between the rejection of the hegemonic ideology of liberal Western states in the domestic political sphere, but paired with efforts to build closer relations with core states of the liberal international order and make positive contributions to key international institutions which underpin that order. And of course, all of this shows how crucial international recognition from those states is, even if it appears kind of paradoxical. The third point really about international recognition is just how context dependent it is. We need to understand the international dynamics that have made India's recognition, its improved relations with the United States, with the Quad countries, with Europe and other parts of the world possible over the last decade. And it might be tempting for some to attribute India's rising international profile to the BJP's strategic prowess or Modi's personal charisma. And certainly those are the narratives that his government have tried to project. But I think it's quite important to note how the geopolitical context of growing US-China polarization has been really foundational to India's global ascent since 2014, and arguably would have been impossible without it. We know that India's international significance has become tied up with the new geopolitical salience of the Indo-Pacific, which of course is a region defined almost primarily by US-China rivalry. And we also know that the Indo-Pacific has been framed by key regional actors, of course, the United States, Japan, Australia, as a space of shared values of freedom and of openness. And these, of course, are projected as values upon which the security and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific depend. And India's particular significance then has been as both a material swing state and an ideological swing state then. And increasing recognition, status, trust, material benefits have come through this Indo-Pacific idea, even though we actually see in policy terms how Indian leadership has understood several aspects of freedom and openness in the Indo-Pacific space quite differently. So just thinking about the recognition context internationally, I'm using the past tense now for reasons I'll come to in just a moment. We've had a curious situation whereby, Western liberal states who've embraced the Indo-Pacific construct, who've embraced India's role within it, have recognized India as a democratic partner, precisely at a moment where many have observed trends away from democracy, and as a defender of liberal order in the face of a China challenge, and of course in doing so have endorsed and bolstered Modi and the BJP's domestic political agenda and its popularity. So sort of costless recognition has not been harmless. So what's next? So to conclude, it's quite interesting how under the second Trump administration, India has fallen from grace in terms of US recognition, at least at the level of the US administration. There are several strands to this. Trump's focus on economic tools of statecraft, and I think his far less geopolitical view of the world under his second administration. This view seems to have temporarily deprioritized China's role as a systemic challenger, deprioritized the Indo-Pacific to an extent. Certainly the Quad seems to be on ice temporarily. And of course, he's also now turning his attention to the Western Hemisphere as the US's sort of primary sphere of influence. We've also had the fallout of the May 2025 conflict between India and Pakistan. Pakistan has certainly had some achievements in unbuilding some of India's recognition gains in the eyes of the Trump administration, and of course Trump's own personal pique at Modi's refusal to attribute a role to him in the cessation of hostilities has been another problem. So what are possible substitutes as new kind of recognition strategies for India under Modi 3.0 and Trump 2.0? And in thinking about this, I sort of took my inspiration from a really fascinating emerging collection of papers in the Forum for Development Studies, edited by Nielsen and Selvaraj. I really encourage people to look at these. They've edited a collection of papers where the authors are interested in how the 2024 elections have signaled a geographical and sociological relocation of Hindu nationalist politics through different institutions, locale, states in India. And I wondered what would happen if we thought of a Hindu nationalist foreign policy in terms of relocations as well. And certainly geographically, we might look to new sensationalized imagery of proximity. If status by association has been a key strategy of Modi, maybe his embrace of President Xi at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit in September of last year allows him as one great civilization or representative thereof to stand with a representative of another. We also have the optics of Putin's visit to Delhi in December, and a sort of resistance, I think, to Trump's bullying expressed through that. We also might look at the recent emphasis on trade deals. Of course, a response to Trump's tariff policies, but as maybe part of a new effort to build recognition networks and relationships away from the geopolitical logics of the Indo-Pacific. We see India now certainly looking at speeches of External Affairs Minister Jaishankar trying to recast India as a confident, rules-based, capable negotiator of modern high-standard free trade agreements, a reorientation evident in the conclusion of the UK-India FTA, now in efforts with the EU, US, perhaps New Zealand, Canada, and so on.
That's a very good point that you've just, we can bring in Javed with his experience, because the kind of statements our External Affairs Minister has made, Jaishankar has made, and like you were saying, that he's come out very strongly and aggressively in terms of contesting all the independent and international rankings. And, you've also written about how they've said that the idea of democracy, they say, is not a Western idea, but it's coming from Indian civilization. So all of those things. And I think that's a very good point to bring in, Javed. I want to start with, in your book, you make a very important point. You talk about, you start tracing the roots of the decisions made in the 1940s, particularly, the partition and the drafting of the constitution, that led
Yeah.
to or created this sort of majoritarianism that we are experiencing in India. And you've also investigated the origins and the consequences of these majoritarian systems. So I would really request you to share your findings with us, and what were those decisions that have led to this quote unquote new India that we're living in and we're trying to grapple with.
Yeah. Well, basically, the point was that in certainly the 1930s, you had discussions between the Muslim League and the Congress,
Mm.
the Jinnah and Nehru and the Nehrus. And basically, I think what Jinnah was seeking at that stage was really not unreasonable. I mean, he was looking at a possibility of a one-third fixed share for the Muslims. Their population, I think, would have been about, 28% or something like that. And a largely federal system. Now, actually, what happened was that you saw a kind of a merger of both the Hindu right and the left in terms of things like a kind of a unitary government, because basically, despite our lip service to federalism, I mean, India's really not properly federal in any sense, and it's become less so now. I mean, the point is that at the high noon of federalism, just looking at, for example, economics in terms of what the states had to spend. I mean, in the 50s, it was nearly 70% the states had access to of funds. Now, through various devices and subterfuges and so on, and that's fallen to around 30-odd%. The point is, the states still have 60% of the obligations, and the center have 40%. So the point is, there's an asymmetry in that situation. But what I was trying to basically argue is that, partition, which I think was completely unnecessary, a sensible thing. I think the cabinet mission plan was actually quite a sensible way of addressing the issue. Because what it also did, in my view, was that it actually neutered or sectioned two big provinces, which were, broadly speaking, not not particularly communal. I mean, more tribal than that. Certainly Punjab was, and Bengal, and less casteist. So you actually had a situation where the cow belts got elevated as the center of this thing, produced 9 prime ministers. I mean, Modi, of course, is technically from Gujarat, but he made a point of standing from Varanasi as a symbol of this kind of thing. I mean, UP, for example, is a huge state. It should have been divided decades ago. But the point is, it's been seen and elevated as a kind of cynosure of the Hindi identity. And that is, I think, very important. And what I think is also important is the role of Yogi Adityanath, who's the chief minister of UP, because the point is that what we hear now, certainly from right-wing thinkers who actually write, they say that now we're away from the Gujarat model and we're looking at the UP model of development. What is the UP model? The Gujarat model was basically a form of, basically a kind of crony capitalism. I'm sorry to use that word, but it was, and it was essentially, the great optics of development, which was basically concrete development. I mean, not development of, education or health or those kind of things. So fundamentally, I think what happened is that we have now this UP development is really incredibly communal. I mean, the main things are things like cow slaughter, temples. I mean, it's an extraordinary fact, but example, the budget of the UP religious affairs was in 2017 was something like 32 crores. And that's gone up to 117 crore. No, 1,017 crores, in the space of 3 years. And, the importance to this thing, I mean, for example, the elections which were held, I mean, if you can imagine that at a time when, the Vatican was not celebrating Easter as thing, the Hajj had been cancelled, the Kumbh Mela went ahead in UP, which led to probably about 5 million deaths. I mean, because the point was that the government, of course, has tried to, limit and show figures of about 50,000, which the WHO and various other bodies have said is just not, they're just not, it's just not believable. But the point is that this was, and the Kumbh Mela wasn't even required to be held at that time. It was only because it was convenient for the government to take control of the cowbell. Now, what is really worrying, you see, is the fact that there is now a move towards what they call delimitation. Now, delimitation is basically something which had been kept in abeyance since 1971. Mrs. Gandhi basically was very concerned about states not controlling their population, and they said, and she was of the view that states that can't control their population should not be in a position to have, by virtue of that, population, a greater say in government. And therefore, the point is the cowbell states, which had a higher growth in their TFRs or whatever, were not were sort of, since 1971, there's been a freeze. Now that's going to change. It was going to change in 2026, but I think now from what I gather, in 2027, there's going to be a census. And on the basis of the census, there's going to be a redistribution of seats, and there's going to be many more seats given. For example, UP will get, I think, 64 more seats as a consequence of that. Now, that will have an enormous impact, I think, on the politics of India, because, I mean, it's not realized, but, 1/3 of India grows at the rate of China. I mean, and that happens to be largely, I mean, apart from, of course, Gujarat is a special thing, there's a lot of investment and a lot of things directed there. UP, of course, GDP rates have been grossly inflated by the infrastructure projects. I mean, I think something like 45% of the roads in India, the big capital intensive motorways and all are based in UP. So that kind of inflates GDP. But the simple point is that the South has generally is very good on human indicators, social indicators. Kerala, for example, Tamil Nadu is there. So the point is that these states, Telangana, done very well. And the point is that this notion of centralization is an attempt by, Modi with the Hindi belt. Because you see, the point is that the kind of politics which Modi is most comfortable with are really the politics of things like othering the minorities, seeking to impose Hindi, homogenization. And I think the problem basically is that, and unfortunately, the Constitution gives him a certain amount of license to do that, because the Constitution, at the time, the Constitution makers, people like Ambedkar and Nehru, were concerned about the country being undermined by foreign elements and whatever, and that we would be the thing. And so therefore, for example, laws of sedition and all the colonial laws were retained. And not only that, but you had also this rather, frankly, strange kind of thing. A lot of the parliamentary conventions, Bagehot and people like that, and so on, which really was really not suited for for a country like for basically a polity like India, which, frankly, I mean, a large percentage of, for example, MLAs are all have got criminal charges against them. They really don't care much about, the finer points or the niceties of political discourse. And therefore, the point is that the road was prepared for someone like Modi. The building blocks were there for him to this thing. Because really, if you look at the constitution, there are really very few checks and balances. It's a kind of Westminster kind of constitution. All right, it's got I mean, the Westminster, you don't have, for many years, Britain didn't have a written constitution. But the point about it is that there was a lot of emphasis on judicial review. I think one of the problems is, I mean, one talks about the minorities and all this, is well, really, how the majority has been affected by the way the nationalists have taken this narrative, because basically they see any criticism of the government being anti-national. Now, if you have that kind of view, then basically government itself, the things which government should be doing, they seem to be, they're not interested in doing. I mean, it's like, for example, law and order. I mean, we have, as a lawyer, we have 52 million cases, a backlog of 52 million cases. I mean, and you go to a police station, there's no redress. You look at health, education, all these areas which government should be doing. And what the government does go around tom-tomming about is things like the GDP and things like digitization and foreign policy, and how this thing which has been discussed. But the point is that it really, at least for those issues, the government may be a facilitator. Certainly in the case of the GDP, there are a lot of factors which go into GDP which really don't have no relevance to the government. But the point is what the government should be doing, and that is if India is to be made a livable society, is really the question of things like law and order, education, health, safety, and matters like that, which unfortunately are neglected, and therefore India can never really be a great power unless it addresses those issues as a government.
Thank you so much for that, and making very important points about how you speak about the UP model, you speak about Adityanath, and this is something that has also been integral to Hindu nationalist politics, is this kind of aggressive, violent politics. The UP model started with normalizing extrajudicial killings, and which is something that we see being replicated in states like Assam. And it has become the new sort of, source. It's seen as inspiring for other states. Other states are following the same, there's no longer any questions around these killings. The fact that Muslim, Dalit, OBC young men are targeted, not just in these extrajudicial killings or lynchings, but also slapped with their, like I said, not only the cases that we know of activists, but several hundreds of people have currently been put behind bars under National Security Act, whether it has to do something with abrogation of 317 Kashmir, or the fact that several working class people in UP are behind bars right now. So thank you for those points, because this is just sort of gives us the idea of the kind of state we are living in, and the kind of impact Hindu nationalist politics currently has on the lives of not only the people who can sit and have conversations or debates about pluralism or secularism, but also their everyday working life. When there is, the basic commodities, food items, everything is so expensive. The wages are not enough. Gig economy, everywhere you see workers sort of protesting. All of them are from marginalized castes and communities. So in this backdrop, there are lots of questions that we've got from the audience. We'll start with a couple of questions. I wanted to ask Sripad. There is a question that has come to us, which is, has India's standing in the subcontinent been, damaged how do you see, the health of our institutions, democratic institutions, particularly the media, judiciary, civil society, and do you think it means anything for India's long-term stability as it aspires to global leadership? I want you to quickly respond to that, and then we'll go to the other panelists with questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, you talked about these indices, but those indices definitely tell a clear story that I think there has been a decline in, several institutions of civil society like media. There are questions about the judiciary. So there is no doubt that all these institutions that are important for a vibrant democracy have definitely declined in India. And this is something that I think if you take these indices as somewhat objective, you see this. But I think there is also a perception in the larger world that this is the case. Of course, how many how many among Indian middle classes? But for example, I live in the US. I look at, for example, US media like New York Times, Washington Post. They are noting this, The Guardian, right? But some of the middle class, upper middle class people with whom I interact who are living in India don't necessarily share this. But there's definitely a, perception in the global audience that this has happened. And this is not this is not a good thing for India.
I also wanted to take this opportunity to ask you that, you've deeply looked at how, like all of these things, rising wealth inequality, jobless growth, our urban divides, all of this have sort of, they intersect with the rise of Hindu nationalism. And you also say that it's an elite backlash against earlier welfare policies.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that, and also its sort of its impact on, like I said, like the question that came to us about its impact on just generally media, judiciary, and overall well-being of citizens?
So, India's growth was at its best during 2008, 2011. Unlike other countries in the West, the financial crisis affected India a bit later. So after that, India started slowing down, growth reduced, and the UPA government did put in a lot of these welfare policies. For example, LARA, land acquisition, which was designed after the experiences from SEZ Act. Now, the Indian corporate sector, Indian elites were not very happy with this. So, in some sense, the support for BJP, support for Hindu nationalism was a backlash against these policies. This is in the context of lower growth, right? So that is the sense in which you could see the rise of BJP as an elite backlash against welfareist orientation in the context of reducing growth.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your response. Kate, I want to come to you. There are a couple of questions that we have from the audience for you. I'll read them out, but I'll also like to add my own question. First, I'll read out the questions. The questions are: in what ways have BJP and RSS narratives shaped India's security and economic policy responses towards China? I'll also read out the second question, which is: how do you evaluate the BJP's future, Modi's eventual succession, and the implications for India's path towards superpower status? And the third question that has come to us is: has India's standing in the subcontinent been damaged by China's Belt and Road policy? And if so, does it matter to the Modi government in terms of its relationships with China?
So it's an interesting question, because I think, when Modi first came to power in 2014, the key signals coming then in relation to China and also Pakistan were, moving away from strategic reticence, being much more comfortable with signaling, power and sort of a response to any incursions across borders, and also a sort of very clear strongman politics, which is what we associate, I think, with both Modi and populists. The idea of standing up to China in particular. Of course, this this runs against, I think, perhaps some admiration for China as a sort of civilizational state, and maybe a kind of a comparable state in a way, an equal sort of partner, which I think is not at all how China sees the dynamic. And of course, also the reality of far inferior material power vis-a-vis China. And so I think we can see quite a lot of the building of a strategic convergence and defense partnerships with the United States and other partners as really a way of managing the period that India still needs to travel to be able to meet China where it is materially, both in military and in economic terms. And I think we can sort of see evidence of that very careful treading of that pathway through the way in which, Galwan was handled. It was a very difficult moment for the government. There were claims that territory had been gained and not given back by the Chinese, and this was sort of managed in a very smoke and mirrors manner, and with no real direct attack on China. As a very sort of careful, non-confrontational, even at the rhetorical level, response. I think with the falling away, maybe it's a temporary falling away, but with the deprioritization of the Indo-Pacific and the sort of polarization of US-China relations at this moment under Trump, India is kind of off the hook. It no longer needs to be seen to be part of a US camp trying to rein in growing Chinese influence. And that takes the pressure off, and I think opens up a number of pathways to have better relations with China. And that leads us to the sort of the third question of the three you asked, which is, I think that good relations with China are a priority because they may enable, and I think perhaps the leadership is hoping they might enable a sort of carving up of spheres of influence whereby, India is top dog in say, South Asia and the Indian Ocean region and agrees reciprocally not to intervene too far into the South China Sea. So there's a way in which that pressure, I think, puts an onus on making that relationship more sort of comfortable and constructive. I wouldn't want to comment on the BJP's future and Modi's succession. I think the names in the mix are quite well known to anybody. I think the thing that I would draw attention to is just how important India's international standing is really for any political party now. Whoever wants to contest an election seriously, I think has to have a clear plan for how India will pursue its goals internationally and keep receiving recognition as an important and emerging, rising, potentially great power. That is irreversible. So I think that's probably the main comment I would have in response to that question.
Can I just add to what Kate said? Just if you look at the numbers and look at the data, China has done far better than India in terms of its economy, right? And several people have pointed out that during the Cold War, Soviet Union was never an economic rival of the US, right? Whereas China is a real economic rival. Now, under a conventional foreign policy of the US, like what Biden was following, India was benefiting from the rivalry between US and China. But under this kind of, a Trumpian kind of foreign policy, India's weakness is very clear. For example, in the tariff war, China has leverage because of rare earths, because of the fact that it is a large importer of soya bean from the US, which is the base of Trump. India has no leverage. So I think, this weak position of India is also more obvious now, in the new context.
Thank you for those additions, Dr. Sripad. Javed, I also wanted to, there's a question for you. I'll just read it out for you. But I also I was very interested by how, you analyze the futility of this cultural purity that is right now, that is, that seems to be the priority for Hindu nationalists in India. And, and you also talk about how this history is being rewritten in various ways. We see that in school textbooks. We see that in university syllabuses. We see that in various other places. And the fact that you also say that, you discuss the role of citizenship and in your book, and you talk about the externalization of the Hindu-Muslim conflict. And I want to come in and say that is it, I mean, yes, it started with, of course, right now in the kind of Hindu nationalist majoritarian country, it is no longer anybody, like you said, anybody who protests or asks questions is not just called anti-national. For example, of course, when the anti-CA movement happened, people were called all kinds of names. And, often a lot of us laugh when we are told to go to Pakistan. And we say, yes, we do want to go to Pakistan. We don't get the visa for it. So, of course,
Visa.
so
Yeah, of course.
that.
Right.
Or the fact that, the farmers who sat in protest for 13 months on the roads, and they were called Khalistanis. And so there is a term for everyone now who sort of protests. So keeping that in mind, I want you to respond to that, and I'll also, read out the question that has come in for you, which is, just give me a minute. It says that the question is Hindutva ultimately compatible with India's constitutional commitment to secularism and pluralism, or does its rise imply a fundamental redefinition of the Indian state? So I want you to respond to these 2 points. Thank you.
Well, let's start with the last one, the point you raise about, which I don't think it's compatible at all, because the point is the Constitution's very clear. It sees it's a constitution which is based on civil rights, and it's not based on religion. It's not a nativist constitution. And I think in 2024, I think there was one of the reasons I think possibly the BJP or the NDA did not do as well as they thought was that a lot of people felt that the constitution was going to be amended, that if they had exceeded 400 seats, that they would be in a position to amend the constitution. I think a lot of Dalits, a lot of the low castes were concerned that their rights would be taken away. So I think on that point, I think they are. I don't think they are compatible. I mean, the one just other minor this thing is the fact that basically the problem also is that the judiciary has been thoroughly compromised. I mean, to the extent that, for example, we have now theocratic judges who, and you see under the Constitution, unfortunately, Article 13 refers to custom as being a source of law. Now, if custom is a source of law, then you see the point is they would say that, look, Hindutva or whatever else, it's not really a religious text. It's our way of life. And therefore, the point is that, therefore, we can instill it through that source. And of course, other things. But you're on your first question, on the question of the externalization, because the point here is that for one thing, the thing which I'm most concerned about is that, people accuse a lot of the Muslim minority as demanding Pakistan and as Pakistan was some kind of favor which was bestowed on them, which is absolute nonsense because, the point is, first of all, of course, that even if we go on the basis of the electorate, which under the 35 constitution, it's only 14% of the population actually had the right to vote. So therefore, the point is that, and the two big states were not League states. They didn't vote for the League. I mean, both Punjab and which were Muslim majority states. So therefore, and of course, you didn't include the princely states. So the point, at any rate, it's not clear that there was a thing, but certainly a lot of the Hindu right wanted to dump the Muslims, I think, in that sense, because they thought that this makes more sense. And it's certainly for the Congress, I think, because the cow belt was their political base. And they felt that they could rule India from that political base, forevermore. And that, in a sense, transpired. Of course, now, since the rise of the BJP has basically substituted the Congress. But in terms of the mentality, if you look at at a lot of the Brahmins of the Congress, and they're pretty rabid, So the point is, it really hasn't this thing. But this idea that somehow the creation of Pakistan would somehow resolve the Muslim problem, the issue of the Hindu Muslim problem, was frankly was really quite fortuitous. I mean, didn't really makes any made any sense and I think the point is that that it's just created further problems for India, because now there's a two front problem in the sense of a China and a Pakistan, who are, and we saw that in unfortunately we saw that in May in Operation Sindoor, where China was supplying most of the armaments and so on. So, so basically, and things are not helped by Hindutva, because look at Bangladesh. I mean, we actually helped found Bangladesh. We saved them from genocide. And the point is that today, because of domestic politics, they are very they are upset with us. I mean, they feel that that we are harboring. Well, we are harboring their former prime minister. They want back to face trial. So, I mean, so these problems are there. But the point is that certainly there was no resolution of the Hindu-Muslim problem by partition.
Thank you so much for that. I definitely learned so much from this. And anybody who's attending today's panel, I highly recommend going and reading everybody's work here. It's fantastic, it's intriguing, and I learned so much from this. I also want to end on this note. I think perhaps if everything that all the three of you, the points that you've made, such important points, one needs to seriously think of about the cost of becoming a superpower. Why is becoming a superpower so important at the cost of your citizens, at the cost of, at a time when you want to be the biggest manufacturing space? And so, which is why, for example, Javed, you mentioned UP suspended labor rights for 3 years, and that was sort of unimaginable in the past, but they said that now for 3 years you not have labor rights. So a lot of these things are now becoming the norm, where a complete dismissiveness of any kinds of human rights, any kind of labor rights, any kind of dignity has become the norm. Aggression, a lot of masculine language, a lot of violence has been normalized, not just in the way we talk, but also in terms of our policies, our actions, the speeches that we see in the public domain. So if this is how India is trying to be a superpower, I think it's worth thinking whether we want to be a superpower and whether it's worth it. I'll stop at this note and over to Charlie.
Thank you very much, Neha, and thank you for moderating. Again, thank you to all the panelists. I think it was a really interesting discussion, and being able to take that deep dive into all these different areas gives a good overview about where India is and where it could go next, and like you say, whether it's worth the drawbacks that will come from it. One to watch. So thank you also to the audience for attending. The next RSA event is on the 17th of February with Dr. Razeen Sally, who will be talking about Sri Lanka, about his family relations to Sri Lanka and his travels across the island, and about its political and economic situation as well. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that.